Hi everybody, fantastic to be with you today. And we were chatting in the breakout room about just, isn't it wonderful to actually be able to network today? And I'll start with an apology, which isn't always the right thing to do, but I'm able to be with you till about mid-morning today. So I'll stay until the Q&A and then I will have to go. But looking at the agenda, I'm convinced that, as somebody said just before, every day's a school day, and I think I'm going to learn just sitting in listening to the presentations in the first part of the day. So I'm Chief Operating Officer of Northern Trains, and as you mentioned, I'm responsible for the day-to-day delivery of the train service, and that covers everything from engineering to our train crew, to our stations teams, to our control room functions. And I actually joined Northern right in the middle of the pandemic, which was challenging for us all. I've been in transport for the last 10 years, as mentioned. Previous to rail, I was in Manchester Airport Group, and prior to that, I was in utilities for 20 years. And the reason I mention that is because thinking about the keynote speech and the theme of decarbonisation reminded me of when United Utilities, where I was, launched their decarbonisation strategy. And it was back in about 2007, and I was a member of the senior leadership team there. We called them the SLT. And very much like a room today, combination of different leaders from across the business, about 100 people. And we would have conferences a couple of times a year, very similar to this. You'd have external speakers coming in to talk to us, except for in 2007, where we came into a room and then we were all taken outside, popped onto 3 different coaches, and the head office, for anybody who knows UU, is in Warrington, taken to the cinema complex down the road. And everybody's like, what is going on? It's totally different for the culture there to do anything sort of risky or different at the time. And then we were taken into one of the cinema rooms and we watched An Inconvenient Truth, and a few nods around the room, and it was a symbolic gesture. And as we left the cinema rooms, we got given, and I remember being handed an LED bulb and handed a device that you put in your toilet cistern for when you flush the loo, you don't use as much water. And that campaign, that strategy for decarbonisation and the way that they engaged the leadership team was really impactful. And I remember there was a character called Captain Chris, and we had lots of posters around, and just simple things like switching off your computer when you left the building of a night. And I was really proud to be part of a company that took decarbonisation so seriously. And it's equally fantastic to be part of Northern as we embark on our net zero strategy. And I want to talk to you today about that strategy and the perspective of an operator. And the strategy sets out our ambition to achieve net zero by 2050, in line with UK government targets, but I stress the word, I'm going to talk to you about our approach to the strategy because it is very much work in progress. So hopefully you know who Northern are, but just as a reminder, it's a very large and complex organisation. We employ almost 7,000 people across the North, which makes us one of the North's biggest employers. We serve around 500 stations, but we directly manage 470 odd of those stations, so huge responsibility there. But our fleet really is the core of our decarbonisation strategy. Again, it's very large and complex, from everything from electric units to diesel units to hybrid units. And we have 4 large maintenance depots. I'm going to head off to the one in Manchester this afternoon. And of our train fleet, of our sort of 400 units, a third are electric, but only 25% of our network is electrified. So I'm just going to repeat that. A third of our fleet are electric, but only 25% of the network we operate on is electric. So clearly our North Star for our decarbonisation strategy is our fleet strategy, and we're working really, really hard on that. What are our options for replacing our diesel fleet if we can't go straight to electrification? So we're looking at hybrid options and where we could run on diesel where there aren't any overhead lines, and then pop the pantograph up where there are. And we do actually have a very small fleet of hybrid units running up and down my corridor, which is the Southport to Manchester line. And from Southport to Bolton, we run on diesel, and then the pantograph pops up, and at Bolton it picks up the electric and goes into Manchester. It's not the easiest of fleet to manage, I have to say, because retrofitting anything onto a fleet is difficult. So our fleet strategy, though, now is looking at hybrid by design rather than a retrofit. But we'll also be looking at alternative modes such as battery and alternative fuel. And all of that will go into our strategy, but it's not going to cover everything. As I mentioned before, 470 stations, 4 big maintenance depots. So we've set about a strategic approach to cover the whole business. And that's been drafted and reviewed internally and externally by a number of stakeholders, including the DFT. I'll just put some scary figures up here now. Hopefully you can all see that at the back. I'll just read out a couple of them. So our strategy needs to address the 364,000 tonnes of carbon we emit as a business. And to remove that carbon would take over 17 million trees. So that is a massive exercise and objective for us. We do have an existing safety, health, environment and crime strategy. We call it our SHEC strategy. And we will continue to deliver against that as we develop our new approach. And we've done some fantastic work. So we've had initiatives such as energy efficiency schemes at our depots and stations, waste reduction schemes, recycling hubs, water conservation initiatives. And some examples of those, so replacing lighting with LEDs has saved an estimated 750 tonnes of carbon per year, and zonal heating at our train care centres has saved an estimated 856 tonnes of carbon per year. And we're also conducting feasibility studies into renewable technologies at our stations and our train care centres. But I just wanted also to specifically mention supply chain, and listening to the sponsors today, I think that's a really key theme for us as businesses as we embark or refresh or renew our strategic approach. So 20 of our key suppliers account for 28% of our total carbon footprint. So a fundamental part of our strategy is working with our supply chain to reduce emissions, either them helping us to reduce ours or them reducing their own. And they're everything from train leasing companies to retail outlets. But we found through our supplier engagement, and it might be not a shock to everybody, that there are a number of suppliers that aren't mature when it comes to carbon management. Some don't measure emissions, for example. So we need to upskill them as part of our strategy. Okay, this looks like a very simple equation, but it just needs some explaining as to our approach to net zero, as there are different definitions. And there's currently, we believe, no rail industry definition. But we need to stay aligned to whatever industry approach there is to decarbonisation. So for us, that means reducing our carbon emissions substantially so that by 2050 we are near net zero and then can sustainably remove any residual emissions. And our approach will be the full value chain. So bringing that to life for Northern. Scope 1 covers all the emissions we will burn directly at our sites, including diesel on our trains, but also things like gas burnt in our boilers on our maintenance centres. Scope 2 will cover the energy we buy in to support our operations, such as electricity to power our train care centres and stations. And Scope 3, which is the most complex, will cover all our emissions that occur outside Northern, and that will include things like customer journeys to stations, materials used to build our stations, and products and services we buy and their embedded carbon. So underpinning our approach is this trajectory to the residual carbon we can sustainably offset by 2050. And we're going to use science-based targets to establish that trajectory. Easy to say. And this is so that it's substantial enough a reduction to be in line with the Paris Agreement. And we're going to be mapping our planning cycles to that trajectory to ensure we can achieve net zero, and setting 5-year interim targets along that. So how are we going to hold ourselves to account in terms of performance against that trajectory? There's a few acronyms on here, joining the rail industry. I realise how many there are. I think every industry is the same. So we will have a performance approach that will look at our strategy already in existence, so we monitor that through our safety and environment group. But we're also looking at our 5-year strategic interim targets. And the key thing about this slide is we're looking at benchmark comparisons, and somebody mentioned greenwash earlier. Just so that we aren't accused of greenwash, we need to hold ourselves to account for customer journeys that could easily be carried out on another form of transport, and make sure that when we're talking about our green credentials, we're talking the truth. So we're looking at how do we compare to those other modes of transport. And you can see here the difference between different electric and diesel fleet on the left-hand side versus electric, hybrid, diesel and petrol cars on the right-hand side in terms of CO2 equivalent emitted per passenger kilometre. And our electric fleet compares really well at 16.4 of CO2 equivalent emitted per passenger kilometre versus 42.8 for an electric car. But if you look at our diesel fleet, our DMUs, if we don't remove our diesel stock or replace it with cleaner sources of energy, as our diesel units are running at 70 CO2 equivalent emitted per passenger kilometre. However, if we think about our full value chain and our Scope 3 emissions, a full understanding of the life cycle of a car and a train are needed in order to make those comparisons true. So how much carbon is used in the manufacture of an electric car and the life cycle of its maintenance versus how much in the manufacture of a train and its long-term maintenance. I'll just bring out some high-level risks and challenges. I won't go through these because I've just seen the red too. So the first and possibly the biggest risk to our strategy is rail electrification. Only 25%, as I mentioned, have you got that, is electrified, and it's not a cheap or easy task to introduce electrification. So whilst we are keen to see those schemes committed to, we're looking at the alternatives. That means we're having to build different scenarios against that trajectory I showed you before, which will look at things like the affordability and the different types of technology we can replace our diesel fleet with. So we'll end up with a number of trajectories based on the different scenarios. We talked about the supply chain earlier. There's a challenge there to work with our supply chain to decarbonise. That's also a massive opportunity, and we know suppliers have started great work in this area. And we're working with the Rail Delivery Group to promote an industry standard enabling relevant emissions to be mapped to relevant sectors. So when we're looking at our Scope 3 emissions and our supply chain, we as Northern can focus on the things that we can control. And the last challenge I just wanted to mention is the lack of available carbon expertise. So I don't know if anybody else has had this scenario. So some consultants have literally sent us an email saying, can't even talk to you right now, we've got so much work. So one of the things we've done is we looked at our own teams, and one of our conductors has got an environmental management degree, so we've taken him out of being a conductor, and he's joined our environment team, and we're upskilling him to work with our environment team. So that just takes me to the next steps and conclusion. So we're going to be developing our strategy over the next year whilst keeping our twin track approach with our current strategy, and that will set out our long-term pathway to decarbonisation of both fleet and non-fleet carbon by 2050. The science-based targets, due to the complexity, will take a little bit longer, so we've said we'll take another year to do that. Our board has challenged us to do that quicker. But to ensure we do this in an engaging way, and back to my sort of UU example, we have parcelled up the individual elements of the strategy, and we've given those to different groups around the business who will look at short, medium and long-term action plans against some of those very key areas of the strategy. And they'll be supported by a carbon task force, which will continually challenge their plans, review and gauge emissions and performance, make sure that the plans stay agile and facilitate innovation to do things differently. So a significant amount to do, but it will result in a net zero strategy using a science-based approach to set our trajectory and targets and ensure our reduction is deep enough to sustainably contribute to the 1.5% limit on global temperature. It's really important for our stakeholders. It's really important for our colleagues. We see it as a business imperative, but so do our customers. And I'll just leave you with this fact. 61% of our customers say they prefer brands that are sustainable, so developing and publishing our net zero strategy is important for them too. So I hope you're looking forward to a thought-provoking day. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll hand back now.